My family cut me out of Grandpa's will, so I revealed his secret that changed everything. Excluded from my grandfather's inheritance because I refused to lie about my sexuality, I discovered a family secret that turned everything upside down. When they begged me to keep quiet, I made them face the truth they'd been hiding for decades. I, 28 never thought coming out to my family would lead to the most explosive family drama and satisfying revenge I've ever witnessed. What started as being disowned for being gay turned into uncovering secrets that destroyed the perfect family image they'd worked so hard to maintain. My grandfather, Robert, was the patriarch of our large Catholic family. He'd built a successful construction business from nothing and was worth close to $3 million when he passed away last year. Everyone knew he was old-fashioned and deeply religious, but he'd always been kind to me growing up. I was his first grandchild, and we had a special bond despite his conservative views. The problem started 2 years ago when I finally came out to my family at our annual Christmas gathering. I'd been hiding my relationship with my boyfriend Marcus for 3 years, and I was tired of lying about who I was. I thought it was time to be honest, especially since Marcus and I were talking about getting engaged. The reaction was immediate and devastating. My father, Robert's eldest son, called me disgusting and said I was embarrassing the family name. My mother cried and asked where they'd gone wrong raising me. My aunts and uncles sat in uncomfortable silence while my younger cousins were quickly ushered out of the room. But the worst reaction came from my grandfather. The man who'd taught me to fish, who'd taken me to baseball games, who'd always told me I was his favorite, looked at me with complete disgust and said I was no longer his grandson. He said I'd chosen to live in sin and that I was dead to him. My Uncle Paul, Dad's younger brother, was the only one who didn't completely turn his back on me. He pulled me aside later and said he didn't agree with my lifestyle, but he still loved me. It wasn't much, but it was something. The family essentially cut me off after that. No more invitations to gatherings, no more birthday calls, no more of the close-knit family dynamic I'd grown up with. It hurt more than I can describe, but I had Marcus and our life together, and I tried to move forward. When Grandpa Robert died suddenly of a heart attack last year, I wasn't even told about the funeral until after it happened. My cousin Jenny, who'd always been sweet to me, texted me 3 days later with condolences and said she'd assumed I knew. That's how I found out my grandfather was dead. The will reading was scheduled for the following week. I wasn't invited, obviously, but Uncle Paul called me the night before and said I might want to be there. He wouldn't say why, just that it was important. I decided to show up, figuring I had nothing to lose. The lawyer's office was packed with family members, all expecting their share of Grandpa's fortune. My parents looked shocked and uncomfortable when I walked in, but they couldn't very well throw me out of a legal proceeding. The will was mostly what everyone expected. The house went to my father as the eldest son. The business was split between Dad and Uncle Paul. Various relatives got smaller amounts of money and personal items. But then came the surprise. Grandpa had left me $500,000 in a safety deposit box, with specific instructions that I was to receive these items regardless of any family objections. The room went silent as the lawyer read this provision aloud. My father started to object, but the lawyer cut him off, explaining that the will was ironclad and this bequest couldn't be contested. But there was a catch. The safety deposit box could only be opened in the presence of the entire family. Grandpa had specifically requested that everyone be present when I accessed whatever he'd left me. The lawyer scheduled the opening for the following week. I spent that week in complete confusion. Why would a man who disowned me for being gay leave me $500,000? What was in that safety deposit box that required the whole family to witness? Marcus and I speculated endlessly, but nothing made sense. The day of the safety deposit box opening, the tension in the bank was thick enough to cut with a knife. My family members were clearly resentful about my inheritance, whispering among themselves about how I didn't deserve it. My father kept glaring at me like this was somehow my fault. The bank manager opened the box, and inside were several items: an old photo album, a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, and a sealed envelope marked for the family. The lawyer opened the envelope and began reading aloud. What came next changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The letter was Grandpa's confession. For 43 years, he'd been living a lie. He'd been gay his entire life, had been in love with his business partner Thomas, and had married my grandmother only to maintain appearances and please his own religious parents. Thomas had been his secret partner for over 3 decades, until Thomas died of AIDS-related complications in 1995. The room was dead silent as the lawyer continued reading. Grandpa explained that he'd lived in fear and shame his entire life, unable to be his true self because of the era he'd grown up in and the expectations of his family and community. He'd built his wealth and success while hiding the most fundamental part of who he was. He'd left me the money because he saw himself in me. He admired my courage to live authentically, something he'd never been able to do. He wanted me to have the freedom he'd never had, to live openly and proudly without fear of financial insecurity. The photo album was filled with pictures of Grandpa and Thomas together. Fishing trips, vacations, Christmas mornings, all documented in secret. They looked happy in a way I'd never seen my grandfather look with my grandmother. The letters were love letters they'd written to each other over the years, hidden away like precious treasures. My father was the first to break the silence. He stood up and walked out of the bank without saying a word. My mother followed, her face white with shock. One by one, most of the family filed out in stunned silence, unable to process what they'd just learned. Only Uncle Paul remained with me. He sat there for a long moment, then looked at me and said, "I always wondered why Dad never seemed truly happy, even when everything was going well. Now I know." The aftermath was immediate and explosive. My father called me that night, screaming about how I'd somehow orchestrated this humiliation of the family. He accused me of manipulating Grandpa before he died, of corrupting him with my lifestyle. When I pointed out that Grandpa had been gay long before I was even born, he hung up on me. My mother called the next day with a different approach. She begged me to keep the contents of the safety deposit box secret, to not tell anyone outside the family about what we'd discovered. She said it would destroy my grandfather's reputation and hurt my grandmother, who was still alive but suffering from dementia. But word had already started to spread. Jenny, my cousin who'd always been kind to me, had been talking to her friends about the shocking family revelation. Within days, people in my grandfather's small town were whispering about the truth behind Robert's lifelong friendship with Thomas. The family was in full damage control mode. My Aunt Catherine called me, offering to double my inheritance if I'd help them maintain the family secret. She said they could tell people that Grandpa had left me money out of guilt for disowning me, not because we shared the same sexual orientation. That's when I realized they still didn't get it. They were more concerned about their reputation than about understanding what my grandfather had gone through. They wanted to bury his truth just like he'd been forced to bury it his entire life. I made a decision that shocked everyone. I took the photo album and some of the letters to the local newspaper and told my grandfather's real story. Not to embarrass the family, but to honor the man he'd really been. I wanted people to know that Robert hadn't been a hateful old man who'd disowned his gay grandson. He'd been a scared, closeted man who'd lived his entire life in hiding. The article came out a week later. It was beautifully written, focusing on the love story between Robert and Thomas, and the courage it took for my grandfather to finally tell his truth, even if it was only after his death. The response from the community was overwhelmingly positive. People came forward with their own stories about Thomas, who'd been beloved in the town, and several older residents admitted they'd always suspected but had never said anything. My family's reaction was nuclear. My father threatened to sue me, though his lawyer told him he had no legal grounds. My mother sent me a letter saying I was no longer her son and that she never wanted to see me again. Several aunts and uncles wrote me off completely. But something unexpected happened. Other family members, ones who'd been quietly supportive, began reaching out. My cousin David, who'd been struggling with his own sexuality, called me crying and thanking me for what I'd done. My Aunt Lisa, Uncle Paul's wife, said she'd always felt like something was missing from the family story, and now it all made sense. Most surprisingly, my grandmother, in one of her rare moments of clarity, saw the newspaper article and smiled. She told the nurse at her care facility that she'd always known about Robert and Thomas, and that she'd been happy for them. She said she'd married Robert because she loved him as a friend, and that he'd been a good father to their children even if he couldn't be the husband she'd needed. The money I inherited allowed me to buy a house with Marcus, who proposed to me with my grandfather's ring that had been left to me in the safety deposit box. It was the ring Thomas had given him in 1978, a simple gold band that represented the love they'd shared in secret for so many years. 6 months later, I received an unexpected visit from Uncle Paul. He came to my house alone and sat in my living room, looking uncomfortable. He told me that he'd been thinking about everything that had happened and that he owed me an apology, not just for how the family had treated me, but for how they'd treated my grandfather. He said he'd started to remember things differently now that he knew the truth. Times when his father had seemed sad for no reason, or when Thomas had been over for dinner and both men had seemed more relaxed and happy than usual. He realized that his father had been living a lie for their benefit, sacrificing his own happiness to maintain the family's reputation. Uncle Paul asked if I'd consider having a relationship with him and his family again. He said his wife and kids missed me, and that they wanted to be part of my life regardless of what the rest of the family thought. It was a start. Update 1. A year later, the family dynamics have completely shifted. My father and mother still refuse to speak to me, but their stance has isolated them from other family members who've grown tired of the drama. My cousin David came out to the family 6 months ago and moved in with his boyfriend. When my father reacted the same way he'd reacted to me, even more relatives took David's side. The local LGBT community embraced my grandfather's story. The town's small pride organization dedicated their annual event to Robert and Thomas, celebrating their love story and the courage it took to live authentically, even if it was only revealed after death. A local artist painted a mural downtown featuring two men fishing together, a subtle tribute that most people understand. Marcus and I got married last month. Uncle Paul walked me down the aisle, and several cousins and their families attended. It wasn't the big family wedding I'd once imagined, but it was perfect because everyone there genuinely wanted to celebrate our love. Most importantly, I've used part of my inheritance to start a foundation that provides support for LGBT youth from religious families. We help kids who've been disowned, provide counseling services, and offer scholarships for college. It's what my grandfather would have wanted, a way to turn his lifelong pain into something positive for others. Update 2. The most unexpected development came when I was contacted by Thomas's nephew, Michael, who'd read about my grandfather's story online. He told me that his uncle had left behind journals and letters that mentioned Robert frequently. He'd been wondering for years who this mysterious Robert was that his uncle had written about with such love and longing. Michael and I met for coffee, and he shared some of Thomas's writings with me. Reading my grandfather's love story from Thomas's perspective was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Thomas had written about how much he'd wanted to live openly with Robert, how they'd dreamed of buying a house together somewhere no one knew them, how they'd planned to travel the world once they retired. But what hit me hardest was reading about how proud Thomas had been of Robert's family, even though he could never be officially part of it. He'd written about watching my father and Uncle Paul grow up, about being at their graduations and weddings in the background, never able to be acknowledged as family, but loving them anyway. Michael gave me a photo of Thomas and Robert together that I'd never seen before. They were in their 50s, sitting on a porch somewhere, and they looked genuinely happy. Thomas had his arm around Robert's shoulders, and both men were laughing at something off camera. It's the photo I keep on my desk now, a reminder that love finds a way, even in the most difficult circumstances. The final twist came when Michael told me that Thomas had left money to Robert in his will, but Robert had never claimed it. The funds had been sitting in an account for almost 30 years, earning interest. Thomas's lawyer had been trying to contact Robert's family for years, but had never been able to find the right people. That money, nearly $200,000 with interest, legally belonged to Robert's estate, which meant it was now part of my inheritance. I used it to buy the house where Thomas and Robert had secretly met for years, a small cabin by the lake where they'd been able to be themselves. I turned it into a retreat center for LGBT couples, especially older ones who'd lived through similar struggles. Update 3. 2 years after everything began, I received a call that changed everything again. My father was in the hospital with a heart attack, and he was asking for me. Against Marcus's advice, I went to see him. He looked older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. When I walked into the hospital room, he started crying. He told me that he'd been thinking about his father's story every day since the truth came out, and that he'd finally understood something important. His anger hadn't been about shame or embarrassment. It had been about grief. Grief for the father he'd never really known. Grief for the pain his father had carried in silence. Grief for all the years they'd spent not understanding each other. He'd been angry at me not because I was gay, but because I'd had the courage to be authentic in a way his father never could. He apologized for disowning me, for the things he'd said, for the years of pain he'd caused. He said he'd been wrong about everything, and that he wanted to try to rebuild our relationship if I was willing. It wasn't an instant reconciliation. Trust takes time to rebuild, and there were still moments of tension and misunderstanding. But slowly, we began to have real conversations. He started asking about Marcus, about my work with the foundation, about my life in general. He even came to our first foundation fundraiser and wrote a check for $10,000. The biggest surprise came when he asked if I'd help him write a book about my grandfather's story. He said he wanted to make sure Robert's real story was told properly, not just the newspaper article, but the whole truth about what it meant to be gay in his generation and how much courage it took to live authentically. My mother took longer to come around. She attended my father's heart attack scare and saw how much our reconciliation meant to him. She started with small steps, sending me a birthday card, then a Christmas gift, then finally calling to ask if she could meet Marcus properly. She's still not comfortable with everything, but she's trying. She told me recently that she's been reading about LGBT history and trying to understand what my grandfather went through. She said she never wants to lose another family member to pride and ignorance. The most meaningful moment came when she brought my grandfather's old toolbox to my house. She said she'd been cleaning out the garage and found it hidden behind some old Christmas decorations. Inside were more letters from Thomas, a few small gifts they'd exchanged over the years, and a photo of the two of them with me as a baby. On the back of the photo, in my grandfather's handwriting, were the words, "My partner, my love, and my legacy." I hope someday he can be proud of all three. I finally understood that my grandfather hadn't just left me money. He'd left me his truth, his love story, and the responsibility to make sure that future generations wouldn't have to hide who they are. He'd known that I would be the one to tell his story, not to hurt the family, but to heal it. Today, 3 years after that devastating Christmas dinner, I'm closer to my family than I've ever been. Not all of them, but the ones who matter. We've learned that love doesn't look the way we always expected it to, that family isn't just about blood, and that sometimes the most painful truths are the ones that set us free. The foundation is thriving. Uncle Paul serves on the board, and we've helped over 200 young people reconnect with their families or find new support systems. The retreat center hosts couples weekends year-round, and I've received letters from people all over the country who've been inspired by my grandfather's story. But the best part isn't the money or the recognition or even the family reconciliation. It's the peace I feel knowing that my grandfather's love story didn't end with his death. It continues every time someone finds the courage to live authentically, every time a family chooses love over fear, every time someone refuses to let shame define their life. My grandfather spent 67 years hiding who he was. I've spent the last 3 years making sure that his truth, and the truth of people like him, will never be hidden again. And every time I look at that photo of him and Thomas laughing together, I know that's exactly what he would have wanted. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't getting back at the people who hurt you. Sometimes it's living so authentically, so fully, so courageously, that you inspire others to do the same. My family tried to shame me for being gay, but instead, they gave me the greatest gift of all, the truth about where I came from, and the strength to make sure that truth could finally set us all free.